各位，如果只看资本市场的数字，英国今天依然像一个发达国家，但巴基斯坦学者梅赫兰古尔指出，当你把所有英国科技公司的市值加在一起，大约是1万亿美元，而与此同时，一家公司英伟达已经站在了5万亿美元之上，而且它甚至不是唯一的例外。谷歌、微软、亚马逊每一家单独拉出来都足以超过一个欧洲国家的全部科技生态。这并不是一个关于谁更聪明的故事，而是一个关于制度、规模与技术路径选择的故事。在过去很长一段时间里面，欧洲相信创新来自稳定、规范、渐进式的改良，而美国压住高风险、高激励和资本快速循环，而中国则在用一种完全不同的方式进入这一场竞赛。真正让外界感到错愕的，并不是中国突然出现，而是人们意识到自己低估了它已经走到了哪里。当人们第一次意识到全球 70% 的电动车来自中国，当 DeepSeek 这样的模型开始被认真讨论，当量子技术、航天发射、无人机和自动驾驶同时出现在同一个国家的技术版图里面，这一种错愕的本身暴露的不是中国的问题，而是外界认知的滞后。长期以来有一句话被反复引用，那就是美国擅长从0到1，而中国擅长从1到100。这一句话并不是贬义，而是一种结构性优势的描述。在过去几年里，最快达到10亿美元估值的公司里面，绝大多数来自于中国。他们不一定是原始技术的发明者，但无一例外都是工程执行、规模扩张和成本控制的极端高手。Team 在不到1年的时间里面，成为美国下载量最高的应用。比亚迪的出口规模超过了整个德国汽车工业，而大疆在无人机领域几乎等同于行业本身。这些公司出现的那么快，部分原因在于中国已经不再依赖外部资本。过去5年，流入中国的外国直接投资明显下降，但本土企业并未随之衰退。融资、上市、扩张，越来越多都在本币的体系里面完成。资本市场的重心正在发生一种悄然但深刻的转移。而与此同时，中国内部并非没有问题，高度竞争带来的内卷化正在消耗人才与社会的耐心。996工作文化引起的反思正在进入公共的讨论，效率与可持续性之间的张力已经被清晰地感知到，而这一种矛盾并没有削弱中国在技术部署上的速度。自动驾驶、太阳能、数字支付并非起源于中国，却在中国实现了前所未有的普及。原因并不复杂，那就是社会接受度、政策执行力以及一个可以迅速放大规模的统一市场。而与之鲜明对比的是欧洲的技术困境。欧洲并不缺人才，也不缺大学，更不缺资本，但真正缺乏的是让成功不断复制的机制。今天技术竞争已经不再局限于本土，中国与美国的较量越来越多发现在欧洲、东盟、拉丁美洲和非洲。游戏、电商、支付、基础设施的投资成为第3区的关键战场。这并不是一场关于谁统治世界的竞赛，而是一场关于谁能提供规模、速度和可复制性的竞赛。技术不再等待制度的成熟，而资本也不再等待价值的共识。而真正的问题是，当梯子已经搭好，谁能最快的爬上去呢？让我们看一下视频。
I talk about how the entire value of all the tech companies in the UK combined would be about $1 trillion. Now compare that with the market value of Nvidia, which is $5 trillion. And that's not the only company. Google is $4 trillion, Microsoft is $3 trillion. So that shows you the extent to which there's a massive gap between what the US is up to and what's going on in places like Europe.
But China is certainly the US's biggest tech competitor, and technology has been placed at the very heart of their next 5-year plan. How do you see China's role in the tech world changing during that period?
So I think China, there's always a big gap between where China is and what perceptions of China are. And that's one of the reasons why people getting surprised by what's coming out of China. People got surprised by DeepSeek.
Yeah.
People got surprised by the fact that 7 out of 10 EVs that are made in the world are made in China. People got surprised by the fact that China at this point has a lead in quantum technologies as well. The fact that the second biggest player in space is China as well. So I think where China is going to be in the next 5 years, we probably first need to get a good sense of where China is right now. And the gap is a lot narrower than we think it is. So what's often said is that the US is really good at putting up ladders and China is really good at climbing them. And if you look at the companies that got to $1 billion valuation the fastest, 8 out of 10 are from China. Kaifu's own company, 01.ai, it got to $1 billion valuation in 6 months as well. So China, even if there isn't a lot that's being invented in China right now, in terms of execution, in terms of engineering excellence, it is doing a lot better than the US. What's often said is the US is really good at getting from 0 to 1. China is really good at getting from 1 to a 100. And that's really the competitive advantage that it's shown in the past few years. So if you look at Temu, for instance, within a year of its launch, it was the most downloaded app in the US. Within, I think, 10 months of its launch, its sales exceeded $5 billion. There is just company after company. If you look at DJI, for instance, it sells more drones than the entire drone industry combined. BYD outsells the entire German car industry combined when it comes to its exports. And BYD was the company that we were not talking about 3 years ago. So there's just a spate of companies coming from China, one after another, that have managed to reach scale. You almost go from not hearing about those companies at all to those companies being the world leaders in their respective disciplines. And that shows you the extent to which scale plays a huge role in China's strategy today. And the fact that they can tap into their domestic markets to raise that capital is also interesting as well. If you look at the foreign capital that's been going into China over the past 5 years, that's really plummeted. So the fact that these companies can still survive relying entirely on domestic sources of capital also shows you that Chinese companies are no longer dependent on international markets to the extent that they were. When Alibaba went public, it decided to go public in New York. Now companies are increasingly deciding to, first of all, raise money in local currency and not USD, and secondly, to list locally as well, which is a big shift that's happened. I think right now it's gone too far in one direction of 996. And if you go to China, the big debate right now is involution, which is over competitiveness. And people talk about Meituan a lot, which was a company that survived with, there were about 5,000 Groupon clones that started in China, and Meituan sort of survived that gladiatorial contest. And in China right now, involution is a big thing. The idea that we probably need to scale back on the competition and people focusing entirely on economic matters. And we need to probably correct in the other direction. So I think there's just too much happening in terms of competition in China, and maybe people need to step away from 996 a little bit. And you can see that refracted through the experience of David Wallerstein himself. His initial job was to bring outside capital to China, and he eventually became the main person taking Chinese money and investing it in gaming studios and other companies all over the world. And that is a big shift that's happening. China going from a place which took in the world's money to a China being the source of much of investments that are happening in the world today.
It sounds too that diversification is an important part of that jigsaw puzzle.
Diversification, not just in terms of diversifying among different industrial sectors, but also diversifying geographically as well. I think one thing that we will see increasingly in the future is China and the US competing for investments in third geographies, whether that is Europe. You already see the largest gaming studios in Europe being owned by Tencent. I'm talking here about Ubisoft. I'm talking here about Supercell, which was the first company in Europe to cross a $10 billion valuation. I think you will also see this competition playing out in ASEAN as well. The top 3 e-commerce marketplaces in ASEAN, whether that is Shopee or Lazada or TikTok Shop, all have some sort of Chinese connection as well. So you will see this competition between the US and China increasingly not happening on home turf, but also in third geographies as well. So I think we're very vividly seeing that in Europe right now, where I think as the debate around technology is being linked more and more to security and geopolitics, you are seeing countries that are trying to play one side against the other. In Europe, for instance, very recently, we saw a Chinese chip manufacturer being nationalized in the Netherlands, for instance. We've also seen examples of robotics.
Talking about Nexperia?
Yes.
Yeah.
And we are also seeing in Germany, for instance, acquisitions from Chinese players being blocked. But if later stage capital is not available, Series D, Series C, Series D capital is not available, and Americans are not writing those checks, the big question is, should Europe be more open to taking money from Asia? And I think we only need to look at ASEAN to see how that might work, because over there you don't really see similar levels of resistance to Chinese capital, and you have places like Vietnam who have been taking a lot of money from Chinese investors. We are now maybe 10 years into technology being talked about in terms of a race. And even now, you're not seeing those big companies coming from Europe. In fact, most of them are leaving Europe. If you look at the big headline examples of tech companies in Europe, you can think about companies like DeepMind, for instance. If you look at the other companies that we talk about in the same breath as DeepMind, this would be OpenAI, this would be Anthropic, this would be ByteDance. These other companies are all hundreds of $billions in value. And DeepMind was sold for only about $500 million. And it's at this point a subsidiary of an American company. If you look at Revolut, for instance, recently the founder decided to change their domicile to the UAE. So it's still Europe not really showing up to the starting line when it comes to the tech race. The question of why that is the case is a very complex one, but just to take one example, European companies tend to be owned overwhelmingly by their founders versus their employees. If you look at an early stage company in the US, it's owned 20% by its own employee base. In Europe, it is about 10%. And that means when these companies go public, there is less money circulating in the environment for repeat cycles of innovation. So one thing that Europe can really do is to really nudge their companies into being owned more by their own employees versus their founders. And that could lead to better investments down the line.
Why is that something that is so un-European from a cultural point of view?
I think people tend to think in Europe, what's usually said is that people have a very conservative mindset. So if you offer them stock versus the comfort of higher salaries, they would always take higher salaries versus stock. Whereas in the US, the incentives are exactly the other way around, where employees would always value stock a lot more than salaries. And I think that's one cultural change that needs to happen for companies to be owned more by their employee base. If you look at, for instance, the exits that happened with Skype and with PayPal, Skype produced something like 11 millionaires and PayPal produced over 160. And that's why you've seen the Skype producing company after company, investor after investor. So PayPal producing company after company, investor after investor. And Skype really hasn't had the same kind of an influence over the tech ecosystem in Europe. And that's entirely down to the proportion of the company that was owned by early employees. I think what people can learn from China is that there's always this assumption that you need a lot of money or you need a lot of other things like research institutions, universities to work properly before you can show up in the tech race or before you can be competitive. And China kind of leapfrogged all of that to become competitive before its universities got there. And I think this really shows you the power of deployment and of adoption. Where you don't really need to be creating those technologies in order to see their economic benefit. You can just be a good adopter of technologies. China was not the place that was the first to develop autonomous vehicles, but if you look at the number of autonomous vehicles on the roads today, China outstrips the rest of the world combined. Similarly, solar technology was not invented in China, but it is the market leader in the world, and China produces more solar panels than the rest of the world combined. There are many different elements at play here. One of which is just social acceptance. I still remember even 5 years ago, people were slashing tires on Waymo autonomous driving taxis in San Francisco. And that sort of extreme techno-skepticism is something that you don't see in places like China today. So having a population that is more receptive to change, that is more receptive to new technologies, it doesn't cost a lot of money to get that. And I think that's one lesson that the world can learn. So I think, first, why do I say that, even though the US is number 3, the UK is number 3, it's still underperforming. It is, given the scale of the difference between what's happening in places like the US and the UK, US and China versus the UK. As I mentioned earlier, the entire market value of all tech companies combined in the UK is about $1 trillion. The fact that the one company that we talk about most often when we talk about AI in the UK, which is DeepMind, is at this point 15 years old. The question is, why hasn't there not been another DeepMind? If you look at the US and how many big AI companies have come out from that ecosystem in the past 10 years, you can talk about OpenAI, you can talk about Anthropic, you can talk about Databricks, you can talk about NVIDIA, but in the UK, we're still only talking about DeepMind. So why is that? Why are we not seeing those repeat cycles of innovation? And all the raw material and the ingredients are there. There are things like the UK still gets more international students per capita compared to the US. It gets the most number of international students per capita compared to anywhere else in the world. It's still a very rich country. It has a lot of money in its in circulating in the system. So the question really is, why has it not been able to convert all of those raw materials into new companies and into new technologies?
So talent is a really crucial part of all of this, not just nurturing it, keeping it.
Yeah. And a lot of people say talent is all that it's about, but the interesting thing there is, I think talent is equally distributed around the world, but opportunity is not. And there's a reason why a lot of great companies come out of Europe, but then they don't stay in Europe. I talked about Hugging Face earlier, which really plays an outsized role in AI at the moment as the central repository, where anyone who's anyone in AI comes together to share their foundation models. It started in France, probably the most consequential AI company to come out of France in the past 10 years. It's no longer there, or has a small presence there. It's mostly in New York. The fact that UiPath moved there as well. The fact that DeepMind is now a Google subsidiary. So it shows that it's not just about talent. You also need to provide talent the right sort of environment where they can flourish. And that is an area in which Europe still has a long way to go.
So what can companies in Europe and indeed other parts of the world do to attract the best minds?
I think talent goes where they think that they can do the best work. And I think the perception that that can happen in Europe or in Africa or in Latin America is still not really there. One thing that I often hear is, Silicon Valley has decentralized. You can have great ideas anywhere. The fact that UiPath comes from Romania shows that great companies can come from anywhere in the world. But what we're also seeing is that these great companies eventually move to established hubs within sort of 5 years of their founding. And that shows the continuing relevance of hubs and being in an environment where other people are doing the same thing. So I think Europe has a lot to catch up on in terms of creating these environments like Shenzhen, like Silicon Valley, where people will feel that they can do their best work. So if I were to give you one example, which is if you look at the entire continent of Africa and look at what's the most valuable company in Africa, it's a company called Naspers. And I'm pretty sure it's a company that you haven't heard about very often. Naspers is, in all of Africa, it's the only company that is listed as an internet company. And so how is it that a company that we've never really heard about is the most valuable company in Africa? Well, the story of Naspers is that it bought about half of Tencent 25 years ago, and that stake grew at one point to being worth over $200 billion. And at this point, the entire value of Naspers is based on its stake in Tencent. And on the one hand, while that's a good story to tell about Naspers and its investing acumen, on the other hand, it's a pretty unfortunate story to tell about the African tech ecosystem. The fact that the most valuable company in the continent is one that owns a small stake in a Chinese tech company shows you the volumes of value that's being created in places in Asia, but at the same time, how unfavorably the African continent compares to that. So if you look at every stock market in Africa, you barely see any tech companies in the top 10 most valuable companies. It is still mining companies, it is still banks, old economy companies essentially. And I'm very worried about what's happening in places like Africa, in Latin America. And the book was really written with that spirit in mind, that we keep talking about the same two places when we talk about tech, but how do we change that debate to talking about how does Africa show up at the starting line? How do the Baltic states show up at the starting line? And that's a big debate that we need to have.
Technology is adopted by young people. And you talk about Africa, there's a huge workforce there of young people. So there's a disconnect, right? They have the potential, they have the ingredients to be doing more.
talent is equally distributed. There's no reason why, if it happened in China, it can't happen in other places. There's a map of China that you can see on social media where 50 years ago, just about every region in China was poorer than just about every region in Africa. And now that relationship has flipped entirely. And if I talk about China a lot in that book, it is with that spirit in mind, which is if they could do it, then other people can do it as well.
How important is location now? I mean, you point out that many tech companies, wherever they come from, are far more similar than the industrial giants of the past.
So I think location is still very important. And in that sense, maybe I'm going against zeitgeist a little bit in the sense that over the past 10 years, it's become increasingly common to say that Silicon Valley is not relevant anymore, Shenzhen is not relevant anymore, you can have great ideas anywhere. But all the evidence seems to suggest that, sure, you can have a great idea anywhere, but those entrepreneurs are moving to hubs, within 5 years or 10 years of starting their companies. You just can't beat the advantage of being in an environment where there's a lot of people doing the same thing, and the ecosystem advantage of learning from a lot of other people who are trying to solve the same problem. So I think hubs are not dead. Maybe there'll be more hubs than there were in the past, but we'll definitely see more of this agglomeration happening rather than less.
But does demand make a difference? I mean, is what the likes of China and what the United States demand from their tech innovators different from a country like India or a country like Nigeria?
So I think that's something that comes up very often in discussions about tech as well, that you maybe first need a market that can sustain these tech companies for you to have these hyperscale companies. But if you look at some standout success stories in tech, these are companies that got to scale not by focusing on their domestic or even their regional market, but by thinking global from day one. If you look at a company like Samsung, for instance, Samsung was born when Korea was still an extremely poor country. At independence, South Korea was 3 times poorer than North Korea, which is something that is hard to imagine now. And yet today, Samsung is the most dominant manufacturer of smartphones in the world. 1 out of every 4 smartphones are a Samsung. And they did that not by focusing on their domestic market. South Koreans did not have money to buy Samsung products, but they did that by focusing on international markets. So while you can make an argument about Chinese companies that they got to scale by focusing on their own customers, there are examples in other places where the domestic market was not there, and you got to scale by thinking global from day one. And that's why I think that even if you're in Africa, even if you're in Latin America, and your own continent is maybe not at par with other places, you can still think global from day one and have companies that can compete internationally.